So, what is it that really draws us together? In our cities and neighborhoods, what are those invisible lines that connect some of us, but maybe create distance between others? Today, we're going to dive into some really fascinating and honestly pretty challenging research that asks a huge question. What truly shapes friendships between immigrants and the native born population in Western countries?
And you might be wondering, why does this even matter? Well, it turns out these friendships are incredibly powerful. I mean, for immigrants, having native-born friends can literally open doors to jobs and services, and it's one of the best ways to get fluent in a new language. But this isn't a one-way street. These connections help break down prejudice on all sides, and they're a key ingredient for a society that really clicks. And it cuts both ways. A lack of these friendships is linked to real-world consequences, like lower wages. So yeah, the stakes are pretty high. Which brings us to the big mystery, right? We talk a lot about things like language barriers, or where someone comes from, or their ethnicity. But if you strip all that away and just look at the data, what's the single biggest thing that decides whether these really important, deep friendships actually form? Well, the answer that the research points to might not be what you expect. We're about to look at what multiple studies identify as the strongest, most consistent social barrier of them all. And there it is. This is the core finding. Across a whole bunch of different studies in different countries, the data consistently points to religion as the most significant dividing line when it comes to making close friends. Not ethnicity, not nationality, but religious affiliation. And to be even more specific, the research found this really consistent pattern. Second-generation immigrants, and we're talking about people who were born and raised in these Western countries, whose families came from Muslim-majority backgrounds, well, they had the fewest close native friends. This pattern popped up so often that it really made researchers dig in and ask, what is going on here? So how on earth do you even measure something as personal as friendship? Well, one of the best sources we have is this massive European study called CLS4EU. Researchers went right into classrooms and mapped out the social networks of thousands of 14 and 15-year-olds. And why teenagers? Because, school is probably the place where we have the best, most unfiltered shot at making friends with all kinds of different people before adult life starts putting up its own walls. Now, the way they did this was actually pretty clever. They didn't just ask about the positive stuff, like who are your friends. They also asked about the negative connections. They had students name their best friends, sure, but they also asked them to name classmates they'd rather not sit next to. And that gives you a much richer, more honest picture of what's really happening socially. Okay, before we get to the results, a super quick stats lesson. They used a tool called an odds ratio. All you really need to know is this. A score of 1 basically means you have no preference. You're just as likely to befriend someone from another religion as your own. But a score that's higher than 1, that shows a clear preference for making friends with people who share your religion. All right, so let's start with Christian students. Their odds ratio was 1.33. So it's a little bit above 1, which means there's a slight preference for making friends with other Christians, but it's not a super strong one. And what about students who aren't religious? It's a very similar story. Their score is 1.43. Again, a slight preference for their own group, but what the researchers call a thin boundary. These two groups seem to mix together pretty easily. But when we get to the data for Muslim students, the picture changes, and it changes dramatically. The odds ratio here jumps all the way to 2.58. That is a way stronger preference for forming friendships with other Muslims than what we see in the other groups. The data is showing a much thicker social boundary here. And here's the real kicker. When the number crunchers isolated all the different factors, gender, how religious someone is, their ethnicity, they found that this religious divide was 1.6 times stronger than the ethnic divide in predicting who becomes friends with whom. Okay, so that was the big pan-European study. But does this trend actually hold up when we zoom in on individual countries? Let's take a look. Data from Britain shows this so clearly. Look at this first number. 63% of second-generation immigrants from an Indian Christian or non-religious background said they have white British friends. Now, compare that to the second number. For those from a Pakistani Muslim background, that figure drops to just 38%. This really suggests religion is a more powerful factor here than national origin. Now let's hop over to Germany, where another study used a totally different method. They created a strength score for friendship preferences. And to give us some perspective, they set the strongest social bond we know, our tendency to befriend people of the same gender, as the benchmark, giving it a score of 100. So using that scale, a Muslim student's preference for another Muslim friend scored a 38.
That is a really powerful preference. It was the second strongest one they measured, right behind gender.
But then, get this. The preference for a friend from the same ethnicity? That scored only a 7. I mean, look at that difference. Once again, we're seeing that the religious connection seems to be a much bigger driver of friendship than the ethnic one in the study. And the data also shows us the other side of the coin. A Christian student's preference for a Muslim friend actually had a negative score, a -23. That indicates an active avoidance, and it helps explain why this boundary feels so thick from both directions.
Okay, seeing all these numbers just begs the question, why? I mean, what's actually driving this divide? The research tries to move beyond just the stats to explore the really complex social stuff happening behind the scenes.
So the research points to a few key things that can make this social boundary thicker. For one, you've got different cultural habits. Think about socializing around alcohol or specific food rules like halal. Those create practical, everyday hurdles. Then there's the way social networks are structured. If you spend a lot of time in religious groups, you're just naturally going to make more friends inside that group. Low rates of intermarriage also play a part, because that's one of the main ways social circles merge over time. And this is so important. The source stresses this is a two-way street. It's also about non-Muslims preferring friends who share their social habits. And here's a really important subtle point. The researchers make a distinction between weak ties, your acquaintances or casual friends, and thick ties, which are your actual best friends. The data shows that many Muslims do have native acquaintances. That religious boundary becomes sharpest when we're talking about those really deep, close, best friend relationships. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty heavy question. The research points out that so many of our deepest, lifelong friendships are formed when we're teenagers. So if these social boundaries are already being drawn so clearly in the classroom, what does that really mean for social cohesion down the road, in adulthood? It's a huge question that the data forces us to ask, but can't quite answer.